Here are the first 50 albums I've listened to in 2024, and I'm going to put you on to the ones I think you need to hear and tell you which ones you can skip. I'm going to be consulting some notes for this because it's a lot of albums. First off, I listened to I Digress by Kelly Moonstone. I had not heard of her before. This was going off of Annabelle Klein's list of the best albums of 2023, but I'm going to say you can skip this album. It wasn't a standout to me. Next up, I listened to Burning Desire by Mike, and this was also from Annabelle Klein's list, and she's a hip hop and rap and R&B curator, so pretty much everything she recommends is going to be in those genres. Once again, I think you can skip this one. My favorite track was Please Don't Cut My Wings featuring Earl Sweatshirt, but otherwise, I don't think you need to listen to this album. Next up, I listened to a lot of people's favorite album from 2023, La High by Sampha. This is one I do think you should check out. I think the hype is worth it. It has some really interesting sounds, but in that hip hop and R&B genre. Next, I listened to Sundial by No Name, and I did enjoy quite a bit of this album, but overall I think you can skip it, so I'd say it's like a 50-50 or a skip. There was definitely some high quality rap on this one though, so if you're looking for some more of that in your repertoire, I would check it out. Last one from Annabelle's list is The Great Escape by Larry June The Alchemist. So once again, I would skip this one. This was probably my least favorite from all the first ones I listened to from her list. Next, I listened to an oldie as recommended by my partner's little sister. It was Diana Ross and the Supremes Join the Temptations. It was a fun listen, but honestly, she has better music. I wouldn't recommend this one. Next up, I started a Discord group for people who love to listen to music, and we're all listening to the same album every day. So one of the first albums that we all listened to together was Poka Slajau by Kiachibani. This one, honestly, I highly recommend. It was my introduction to Polish music, and I thought it was really strong. Next, I listened to Caribou by Elton John. I'm trying to listen to every Elton John album in order this year, so this is just one on my list, and I would not recommend listening to this whole album. He has such a large discography, and with that comes a lot of albums that I just don't think are necessary listening. Next, I listened to Marketplace by the Namby Pamby. I had never heard of them, and this was a really pleasant surprise. I'd give it like a 50-50. You might really enjoy it. It has an indie alternative kind of vibe, but it wasn't like groundbreaking, but it was really enjoyable. Next, I listened to Think Later by Tate McRae. The first time I tried to get into this album, I really couldn't connect to it, but this time I like fell in love with about half of it, so I once again would give it a 50-50 rating. But for like a getting ready with the girls kind of album, it's so fun. I really love Guilty Conscience, Think Later, Exes, and of course Greedy. Next up, I checked out Never Enough by Daniel Caesar. I do really like his work, not all of it though, and I haven't really found a whole album of his that I love. This is another case of that. I don't think you need to listen to this whole album. He makes beautiful R&B music, but I just find that he struggles to come up with an entire body of work that's just flawless. Like I always find that there's some skips for me. Then I listened to an EP earlier from 20 by Runo Plum. This was enjoyable, but I would say you can skip it. It was just like easy listening music, indie vibes, but not like something that stuck with me. Then I listened to One Sided by Sydney Rose. This was like indie pop. I would not recommend this one. Then I listened to Drunk on a Flight by Eloise. This was the first time I'd listened to Eloise, and she has a jazz indie pop sound, and I really enjoy her. I think she is going to continue to make great music, and I would highly recommend this album. I listened to Forward Slash by Leanna Firestone. This was an interesting one where every song had two parts. I thought the concept was really cool, but the execution could have been better, so I would not recommend this one. Then I finally listened to I Got to Mold Cosmic Blues Again Mama by Janis Joplin, which I had heard some songs from, of course, but I'd never listened all the way through, and I absolutely recommend this one. I think this is a necessary album for everyone to listen to. It really just encapsulates Janis's energy. If you're not super familiar with her, or if you are, I think this is a necessary listen either way. Next on my Elton John kick, we have Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. This one I actually would recommend listening to. I thought it was really fun. There were a lot of songs I saved, which is not always the case. I felt like this time he nailed the concept and was able to have a lot of strong hooks, which has been something he's been lacking in a lot of the previous albums. Speaking of which, next I listened to Rock of the Westies by Elton John, and he went back downhill on this one a little bit, I would not recommend listening to this. As well as Blue Moves by Elton John. I don't think you need to listen to that one as well. Next, I listened to Sleepless In by Epic High. This was a cool concept again. It was about all these different scenarios in which you could be sleepless or like have trouble sleeping, and all these songs related to sleep. While I enjoyed the concept, I didn't feel like I needed to listen to it again, so I wouldn't recommend this one. Next up, another one from Annabelle Klein's list, we have Girl in the Half Pearl by Liv. This one did not stand out to me. I didn't save any songs, and I wouldn't recommend listening. Next up, we have, not sure if I can say this, by The Cure. This is just like a really classic album, but I'd give it like a 50-50 because I feel like they have a lot better music. In general, I like The Cure, but I'm not like a mega fan, so this one isn't one that I'd come back to, but I assume if you are a huge fan, you love this album and already know it well. Next, I listened to Cinema by the Marias. I'd already heard most of this one, but not all of it, and I really enjoyed what I had heard. I love the track All I Really Want Is You. They have this really understated R&B indie vibe on it where they come in with this beat drop that's really killer, but it's super subtle. I would highly recommend checking this one out. Next up is Orquídeas by Kali Uchis. This I think is going to be one of the best albums of 2024. I highly recommend checking it out. It was a absolute no skips album for me. I've come back to it so many times already, and it's just fantastic background or full focus music. I listened to American Dream by 21 Savage. I actually really enjoyed this album. Of course, classic 21 Savage. We have a lot of 2121, but I think that adds a lot of character. He talked about some really interesting subjects and he had some really great verses, so I would recommend listening to this album. Next, I listened to Bar Chords by Bahamas. This was a very forgettable album for me. I would not recommend it. I listened to In Control by Natro Synth. Once again, very forgettable. I wouldn't recommend this one. Then I listened to every Indigo D'Souza album. So I listened to I Love My Mom by Indigo D'Souza. This was absolutely my favorite Indigo D'Souza album. I highly recommend it. It was super confessional, really high quality indie rock. Then I listened to Twins in the Womb by Icky Brickets, which is Indigo D'Souza's side project. I highly recommend this one as well, particularly Ankle Wrist. That song is fantastic. It has much more of an explorative and alternative sound than her other work. Then I listened to Any Shape You Take by Indigo D'Souza. This was definitely my least favorite of her releases. It just felt a little more disjointed for me. But this is when I learned about her album cover art, which is that her mom paints all of her covers, and that leads into the concept that threads through all of her albums, thinking about age and death and how her mom inevitably is going to die and what that means to her. And she's tackling these thoughts throughout the albums. I think it's a wonderful concept and super relatable because it's something that everybody faces. Now we're back to Elton John. I listened to A Single Man. This is another one I do not think you need to listen to. Then I listened to Victim of Love by Elton John. Again, you don't need to listen to it. But then I listened to 21 at 33, and I loved this album. I felt like he really turned things around for himself again. He had a lot more of his like interesting kind of playful songs. Do you know the quality that he has in a lot of his songs? Well, a lot of his best songs where he combines different rhythms and tempos, and it almost feels like multiple songs combining. There were quite a lot of those on this album, which I'm really drawn to, so I would definitely recommend checking this one out. Then we had The Fox by Elton John. This one I'd give like a 50-50. I liked about half of it, so if you're a big Elton fan, I would go for this one as well. Then I listened to Leche Da by Bill Ryder Jones. This was the first time I've listened to him, and this album just came out. To me, he struck me as like a less devastating Sufjan Stevens. So he had kind of that indie folky pop vibe. I wasn't a huge fan, but he made some good music. So if you're a big Sufjan fan, I would recommend checking this one out, but otherwise, no. And I listened to If the Shoe Fits by Pure Prairie League, which is just some classic country. And I do think this one is worth the listen because I think this is like what country music, well, some of what country music is lacking today. Then we had Tungsten by Healy. I had listened to some Healy before, but not much, and this was a good R&B album. I thought it was quite solid. I definitely think if you're a fan of R&B and pop, that you would find something you like on this album. Then I listened to Rolling Up the Welcome Mat for Good by Kelsea Ballerini. I didn't connect with this one. It was a fine breakup album, but I wouldn't recommend it. Then I listened to Sol Maria by Eladio Carrion. It was fine, but not particularly memorable, so I wouldn't recommend it. Next up, we have On Top of the Covers by T-Pain. If you haven't heard this one yet, I expect you've at least heard Tennessee Whiskey, but if you haven't checked out the whole album, I can't highly recommend it enough. Like, this is one that I just keep coming back to. He does some outstanding covers that you would have never expected from a whole variety of genres. He also ends with singing his own song, Buy You a Drink, in a way that's just better than the original. I can't even explain it. You just have to listen. Then I listened to Little Rope by Sleater-Kinney. This is a brand new release from them, and I thought this was a really good album from an older band, which I feel like a lot of times bands that were really popular, they'll release new work when they're a lot older, and it just does not hit the same, but I felt like this one was really strong. I would definitely recommend checking it out. Then we have Admiral Sunbright by Grant Milliken. This one was interesting. It had a cool avant-garde vibe that I really liked, but I just couldn't get into his voice. So for that reason, I wouldn't recommend it. Then I checked out the new Green Day album, Saviors, and I honestly fell in love with it. Most of the songs were really catchy. There definitely were a few that kind of fell into the trope of like, we have seen so much change occur in society and everything's different, and like that kind of vibe I feel like is really overused, but those didn't deteriorate the whole album by any means, so I would highly recommend checking it out. I think they totally still have that driving punk rock, pop rock sound that makes Green Day Green Day. Next up, we have Jump Up by Elton John. You don't need to listen to this album. And I listened to Cloudward by Mary Halvorson. This was a jazz album. I really loved the opening track, The Gate, but after that it transitioned into a very abstract and explorative sound, which showed a very high level of musicianship, but it just wasn't something that was easy for me to listen to. And that's completely fine, but it wasn't what I was looking for. So at this time, I didn't connect with it. So I'd give it like a 50-50 recommendation. But I think for big jazz fans, this is totally worth checking out. Then I listened to Talent by The Crane. This one was really fun for me. I enjoyed the pop sound, and it was my first time listening to Taiwanese pop. I wouldn't give it a complete recommendation just because I felt like there were some skips, but I'd give it like a 50-50. And if you're really into pop, I would recommend this one. Then I listened to Snow Angel by Renee Rapp. I am in love with some of the songs on this, but then there are others that I don't see myself ever returning to, so I'd give it a 50-50 recommendation. I do think her voice is outstanding, and some of the really cool songs I think are Talk Too Much, Poison Poison, and Pretty Girls. There's some great rhythms on them, and they're totally like good getting ready songs again. Then I listened to Songs the Lord Taught Us by The Cramps. This one was my dad's recommendation, and honestly, I loved this album. I will absolutely listen to it all the way through again. I really feel like that's the best way to listen to it, and I think this is one that everyone should check out. The 49th album I've listened to was Lyrics to Go Volume 5 by Coda the Friend. If you've been listening to Coda the Friend for a while, you know that he has like a pretty hit and miss track record. His great songs are just unbelievable, but then there's a lot that are just skippable. This whole album was pretty much skips. There were some crazy lyrics that I'm like, did you not have anybody proofreading these? If you want to know what I'm talking about, definitely check out Backstage in Minneapolis. The only song I see myself coming back to is Oregon. And the 50th album I've listened to in January is The Stranger by Billy Joel. This is a very famous album, but I'd never heard anything off it besides Vienna. Now that I have, there's quite a few others that I see myself listening to again. Also, there's such a striking resemblance between a lot of his and Elton John's work, which I know people have said before. It's just really in my face, having listened to a lot of Elton lately. But yes, I would recommend this album. So those were the first 50 albums I've listened to this year. If you're interested in joining that Discord group I talked about, you totally should. There's like 80 something of us. We all listen to an album together every day and talk about it, and we all recommend different ones to add to the list. I'll put a link below, but sometimes that stops working, so if so, feel free to DM me on TikTok or Instagram and I'll get you in there. And otherwise, subscribe for more music recommendations, and I'll see you next time.